for being here for our first Sunday for the month of November. We are doing our taping mid-month, so it'll be ready for you to view on our Elam website. And if you weren't able to catch last month, the presentation was by Dr. Capel on caring for creation. And I did look at it's on the website and just some instructions on how to find it. There's so much good information on the website. So I'll give you a tip. So you go to the Elam website, go to the Get Connected tab, and then look for groups and gatherings, and open that up, and then you look for adult enrichment, and then scroll down, look through that page, and then you will get to the October 4th, Dr. Capel, Me, the Tree, and the Trinity. So if you're interested in attending these presentations as part of our live audience, we're limited to 10. So hurry up and get your name on the list. All you have to do is register with the church office. So email or call Jennifer Haynes and she will get you on the list for our next month's presentation. And there will also be, this presentation will be available on November 1st, the first Sunday. And you can see that. There'll be a separate link for that if you follow the directions I gave. I'm also going to put a plug in for next month's presentation, or December 6th actually. It's hard to keep track of how to say this so that it's not confusing. December 6th, first Sunday, will be taped in mid-November. And that presentation will be making sense of COVID-19, lessons from the Black Plague of the 14th century. So it'll be a nice topic for us who are all tired of the COVID, thinking we have it terrible. We'll find out it could have been worse. Presenter will be Dr. Mark Trandvik, Professor of Reformation History and Theology, now at Luther Seminary. And recording date is tentative yet. We will be in mid-November. So please contact Jennifer and let her know if you'd like to be on the list, and then we'll let you know when the actual date is. So, and I will also just say a word of thanks for Dennis Joslin, who is our audiovisual expert, and he is here with me today. And we'll have this edited and do, as he does, wonderful work, so thank you, Dennis. And also for my colleague in helping to set up the adult ed, Harold Erickson, who's also with me today, and we are excited to be able to come up with the ideas and the speakers and to connect with our communities who are got some incredible information and experiences that we can share with all of the Elam community. So today's speaker is Pastor Kelly Chatman, and the title of his presentation is The Life Story of a Minneapolis Black Lutheran Pastor and His Work to Promote Equity and Engage the Church in Racial Justice. Kelly Chatman is the former pastor. He just retired of Redeemer Lutheran Church in Minneapolis, and now he's the director of the Center for Leadership and Neighborhood Engagement, also known as CLNE, which is through the ELCA Synod. We're excited to have Pastor Chatman here. He has spoken at our church, been at council in the last couple of years, so many of you are familiar with him. And it's great to have a neighbor here today with us. Looking forward to hearing your talk, and welcome, Reverend Chatman.
Thank you, Ann. Harold, Dennis, it's lovely to be here with you today in your lovely church, and I've had the pleasure of being a colleague with Pastor Dan for many years, and I just heard so many wonderful things about Elam. Over the years, I'm sorry I don't remember, there was a young man named Jordan who was a youth through middle school and high school with some of the youth at Redeemer, and remember Jordan went on to NDSU to study pharmacy at, so it's a pleasure being with you today. A little bit about me, and as an African-American Lutheran, I often like to kind of share a bit of my story. When I'm in Lutheran congregations, I feel the need to credential myself, not with degrees, but how Lutheran I am. And my parents moved from the segregated South to the industrial North, part of a great African-American migration in the 50s, and I was just a young child, and we moved to a new neighborhood, and I was sitting in 7th grade, and I didn't go to church very much, but our father had a rule that if we wanted to go to the movies, we had to go to church on Sunday. And so going to church wasn't exactly a religious event when we were children. It's something we had to do in order to get what we really wanted. And so we called it taking a dive. And but I was sitting in 7th grade and listening to my new classmate, Willie Woods, and Willie was animated, and he was talking about how pretty the girls were in his Sunday school. And I wasn't very religious, but when he described how pretty those girls were, I felt a conversion coming up. So I invited myself to visit Willie's church, and it was about a mile from our home, and it's in this really nice neighborhood that was called Indian Village, and my brothers and sisters and I referred to those homes as mansions. But that's where the church was, according to Willie's directions, and there's a sign in front of it that said Christ Iroquois Lutheran Church, and I didn't have a clue what a Lutheran was. So I walked up the steps and opened the door, and I heard children singing, so I thought, well, this must be the right place. And so I couldn't see anyone, but I followed the voices of those children singing, and I walked down the steps and down the corridor, and just as I rounded the corner, I could hear the children singing. And as I rounded the corner, there stood the entire Sunday school. And when they saw me, I think they stopped singing. I know when I saw them, I stopped walking. And I was standing there, this entire Sunday school was white, and you know how you have that tape going about where you belong and where you don't belong? And as I was standing there with that tape going, the only thing I could think about was, I'm going to kill Willie Woods. I thought that he'd set me up with this masterful middle school prank. But as I was standing there and I was trying to figure out how to exit, 2 Sunday school teachers came over to me, and they gave me some instructional material about somebody named Martin Luther. And they escorted me to the front of the entire Sunday school. And the Sunday school began to sing these words: there's a welcome here. There's a welcome here. There's a Christian welcome here. It's like vistas open up for me, a reality that I'd never imagined. That embrace about a welcoming God was transformative. And from that moment on, I every time the door was open, I was in that church. And my siblings started going to that church. And the year that I graduated from college, my parents joined that church. And so it's a wonderful example about the welcome of God, the reality of God, and the vistas that open up for us when we know and experience God's welcome. It's that welcome that I'm here to invite and challenge Elam to be even more bold in your identity as the welcoming community of God. As you do that, and you have a history of that, I've been blessed over the years to be in association with David Narathan, whose father was a pastor here, and Rick Johnson, who was also a long-term member here many years ago. And I think Julie Sevick was a youth director, and Heidi Hagstrom, and both of them served on staff with me in Chicago when I was the director for ELCA Youth Ministries. So there's a rich history in this congregation, and in your location, there's so much opportunity to exhibit God's welcome in a powerful way. And I'm just here today to remind you and celebrate with you and encourage you that God is not through with Elam yet. God is not through with the Lutheran Church yet. and that there's wonderful opportunities for future, as we embrace God's welcome and are the beacons sharing that light in God's world. So a little bit about that. Since I became a member of that church, Christ Christ Lutheran Church, in the 60s, and I went on to Lutheran High School, graduated from Lutheran High School, Lutheran College, Lutheran Seminary, and that story, that journey, unfortunately, has not been as inclusive of the breadth of the diversity of God's people, and that's a challenge that we have. And I am really thankful for the opportunity to join you in that journey, to be more inclusive in our embrace, more bold in our embrace, more confident that what we do with God, we do not do alone. And so I came to Minneapolis following my beautiful wife in the year 2000. And I was fortunate to have received a call to Redeemer Lutheran Church on Glenwood Avenue in North Minneapolis. And in that journey, we went from being a congregation of 35 people to over 250 people. And much of that growth happened as we began to see that the life and vitality of the congregation wasn't just measured by how many people were sitting in the pews or what happened within the walls of the church, but how we extended ourselves beyond the walls of the congregation. There's an organization called Sacred Places out of Philadelphia that does research about all kinds of churches throughout the United States. And their research says that 6 out of 10 people that go through the regular congregation are non-church people. So I would say, based on research, that in a non-pandemic time, that 6 out of 10 people that come through a church like Elam are not church members. And what's important about that is to say that when we measure the vitality and the impact of a church, it's not just how many people are sitting in our pews on Sunday morning, but there are many ways through Alcoholics Anonymous or a relationship with other faith groups, all the activities of the church. And my goodness, you have a wonderful space here that even more ways of being and engaging people in your congregation can be a vital sign that not only are you in this place, but God is active in impacting lives in this place as well. So during my time at Redeemer, one of the things that I realized when after serving as director for youth ministries for all of the congregations of the ELCA, and I was then the pastor at Redeemer, and I'm looking out and I see 35 people in the pews, and I'm thinking to myself, what am I doing being the pastor of this congregation of 35 people? You know, when I get, a significant salary, I've got a significant education, I've got an amazing wife, and I was asking myself, is this okay? What are you doing here, God? And then it came to me and said, I wasn't just the pastor to 35 people sitting in the pews. I'm the pastor of a neighborhood of 4,000. And I think, and I look around Elam, and I look at the buildings and the businesses and all the activities in this community. My goodness, if you can measure your calling as a congregation and the call to support ministry in daily life where people work and where people play, where people learn, how engaging and how amazing might the ministry be of this congregation and your legacy continue if you can expand the impact of your ministry. But it's not just based on Sunday morning or even this building, but how you unleash people to be that welcoming body of God in God's world. So at Redeemer, that reframing really opened up the doors for new possibilities. And the number of people that say that Redeemer is their congregation and they've never been inside the sanctuary. Wrestle with that, if you will. But our calling to embody the promise and the welcome of God into the lives of all of God's people. And how wonderful it is to be able to say that it's a Lutheran church that is having that impact. You know, Martin Luther referred to something called the community chest. And it's kind of a way of saying, like from the book of Acts, about holding all things in common. That this collective reality of God for the whole of the community. So as you continue to do amazing worship and be an amazing community, but the opportunity to expand that into a broader collection of God's people. So welcoming is it's a really important part of my story, because how I experience children and Sunday school teachers welcoming me. And that welcome went on to impact my parents, who joined the year that I graduated from college. My journey as a youth, through college, through seminary, experiencing privilege, and man, can I tell you some stories about that journey about transcending the boundaries of race and class and culture. And we need practice at that. All of us do. And so that's another opportunity that the church, you know, I want him to understand that the church is the most powerful institution in the world, because there's no other institution that says it doesn't matter who you are or where you're from, you are welcome into the body of Christ. You are welcome to be that experience of belonging, of being a child of God. There's no other institution that says that. So when we form our liturgy, it's an invitation that everyone should be able to walk into that, being fully who they are, and knowing that they are a child of God. So God's welcome is foundational. At Redeemer, one of the things that we did is moving beyond the walls of the church. And again, Redeemer does wonderful worship, but it's often nuanced, and there's some added flavor to it, if you will. We can say more about that later. One of the things that really helped me, and I hope that if you're at home and you've got a pen or a pencil, write this down, because this is really instructional. It's really helpful for me. When I was doing my seminary training, there's something that we do called clinical pastoral education. And I was at Washington Hospital Center in Washington, D.C., and we had a gentleman, his name was Dr. Edwin Nichols from the National Institute of Health, and he talked to us about social science. And he talked about how in the United States, social scientists have determined that people operate in the United States out of three basic worldviews. And one worldview is not better than another worldview, but it's really important to know that people operate out of a basic worldview. And so he broke it down. He said that for African American, Native American, and Hispanic people, the dominant worldview is relationship. So in the example of that worldview, how I feel in relationship to my environment, how I feel in relationship to my community, how I feel in relationship to the world is fundamental from the African American, Native American, Hispanic worldview. And then he said that in the United States, and again, one worldview is not better than another worldview. But he said in the example of Asian and Pacific Islander, the dominant worldview is conformity, following the elder, speaking with one voice. And again, one worldview is not better than another worldview. But then he said that for people that are European descent, i.e. white people, Caucasians, said the dominant worldview is acquisition of object. So that's about like accumulation. So things like, how much do you know? How much do you make? And the one that I see that's really big is how much time do you have? So those are commodities. And again, one worldview isn't better than another worldview. But thinking about how people, when they come into the places of gathering and welcome, that people are coming with a basic understanding of a worldview. So why I think that's so helpful and so important for me, when I think about worldview and I think about Sunday morning, and Sunday morning often is the most segregated hour of the week, I think about how worship reflects our worldviews. So, for example, I have been in a group of 200 youth, and I asked those 200 youth, how long is a Lutheran worship service? What are they going to say? 1 hour. 1 hour. And I asked them, well, did you learn that in confirmation? So where does that experience, that knowledge of that value come from? It's culture. It comes out of our worldviews. And so you can walk through our liturgy and say that we want to be inclusive in inviting people to be a part of our congregation, be a part of our worship, but we worship out of a particular worldview, that the worship service is going to take 1 hour in the Lutheran, Presbyterian, Episcopalian tradition. But in the African American, Latino, or in Reverend Hardy's church, worship will take as long as it takes. So you look at that, and so how our worldviews are ways that we continue to segregate ourselves. I was taught in seminary that a really good sermon will have 3 points to it. And so we listen for those 3 points. That's acquired knowledge. Or if I really get started and talk about our music and the ELW, that's acquired music. That you cannot use that ELW if you don't know how to either read music or assimilate and learn how to do that. You acquire the ability or the knowledge to do that. Well, people that are coming from the Latino, Hispanic, African American tradition, they're not likely to stay around long enough to learn how to facilitate our Lutheran worship, or Episcopalian, or Presbyterian. So my point about that is that if we want to be inclusive, if we want to be diverse, then we have work to do to share that experience and value that people bring with them. And I don't mean that to make it exclusively about worship, but Elam, as you reach out to the diversity of your neighborhood or neighborhoods, to think about when you invite people to a meeting, if the typical way that we send out an announcement about a meeting is where we'll say what time it starts, what will the agenda be, what time will it end. Well, those reflect a particular worldview that's about accumulation, that time is a commodity and you don't waste time. Well, another tradition is time is relational. And the example of a sermon, I'm sorry, I keep going back to worship, but in the African American Latino service, it's not about listening for 3 points, it's about listening for a relationship. Amen? 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 So it's that interplay. So, and again, it's just not about right or wrong. It's about being clear about what do we want. And then what will facilitate us getting what we want. If we want a relationship, if we want to be a more diverse congregation, if we want to be a more diverse church, then we can't just do that expecting people to operate out of our particular worldview. It's about sharing our experience, sharing that welcome. Well, connecting. These are a couple of sayings that I have heard over the years, that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. That's a statement about being in relationship with people, that people will get more from how they experience us than they do than what we say to them. May not reflect our place of comfort or our particular worldview. You have to earn the right to be heard. That's a saying that comes out of Young Life, and how Young Life is really spot on when it comes to the communication with young people. And learning that the right to be heard is about connection. It's about spending time in another person's space. And then the other one is where you come from, speak so loudly I can hardly hear a word that you are saying. And those are examples about like being in the presence of others, sharing in the experiences of others. Which worldview reflects my everyday living? This would be a good time if we were not in a pandemic to be in small groups to actually have conversation. And how often do I interact with someone from one of the other worldviews? And in my encounters, which worldview is valued, which is dominant? Now, I would hope that, and again, thank you for the opportunity to be with you today, but I hope that this would be an opportunity for you at Elam to have conversations around your tables, or maybe there's a way to have Zoom groups that actually have these conversations, so that it's not about a voice of an expert, but the opportunity to really wrestle with some of these things. And I really hope that this is not where you're positioned about right or wrong, or that this is about shame or judgment, but an invitation to maybe rethink what it is that we want, and what does the future look like, and what do we need to do to be participants in the future. And really what I hope and dream is the opportunity to be leaders in the future, which is a plug that I'll do now, that this new center that I'm heading up, it's the Center for Leadership and Neighborhood Engagement, and it was birthed by the Senate out of an appeal. And so what we're doing is to support congregations as partners to connect more with their neighborhoods as a measure of congregational vitality. And the research that comes out of the ELCA is that the congregations that are connecting with their neighborhoods are the congregations with the most signs of vitality. And that's not restricted to the city, but it doesn't matter what community you're in. You can look at congregations that are connecting with their neighborhoods and actually measure the vitality and the impact that has on those congregations.
Pastor Kelly?
Yes.
When you say connecting with neighborhoods, say a little bit about what you think about, like the way you might support them financially versus connecting them in a more relational way.
When we talk about connecting with neighborhoods, there's actually there's a framework that we're operating out of. And that framework is that what congregations do is congregations welcome people. When we say that we worship, that really translates that God is welcoming us into this event where two or more are gathered in my name, there am I in the midst of them. So when we worship, people experience that they're safe, they experience belonging, they experience what it means to be God's beloved. That's worship. Then the next thing that the church does is we teach the catechesis of the church. And that's about not just cognitive head knowledge, but it's also experience and exploration. So how do we come to know the reality of God? So with the center, it's a partnership to be, first of all, take what happens inside the church building and translate that to how it happens in the community. That people out in the street or in the community experience belonging, experience that they are beloved, experiencing that God has meaning in their lives. So worship. And then education, catechesis, that's uncommon conversation. That's a meal around a dinner table. That's immersion experiences. It's encountering other people beyond the boundaries where we experience how God enlivens that interaction, that encounter. So where do we get to experience the reality of God? That God in my life, God in the world makes a difference. So, beloved, safety and belonging, experience and exploration. And then finally, discipling or witnessing, that is actually the fulfillment of our potential. That is the experience about giving back, that as a person, God calls me to make a difference in the world. God empowers me to make a difference in the world. So the Center for Leadership and Neighborhood Engagement is to accompany congregations to have those experiences that happen inside the church building, to have those experiences outside of the church building. So it's really a translation of what we do and experience and celebrate inside of church buildings, to have those experiences beyond the church building. And our belief is that is the kind of vitality and also reinforcement and revelation that we are not different and that the church is present in the world. It moves beyond the privatization of religion. It's a big part of what that is. So, and what we're doing is we're setting that up in partnership with congregations, and our goal is $5,000 partnership to get this array of services. And the other thing about the services is that it's grounded in three training principles: organizing, something called the intercultural development inventory, and then the asset-based community development. And the asset-based community development is to move beyond the way that we see people other as deficit. So really, it's a big part of that is like the way that North Minneapolis is framed, that, oh, there's all bad things and crisis and all the negative. Well, that's not, North Minneapolis didn't set that up. We did. And so that becomes a cycle, which I will get to that. So in answer to what the Center for Leadership and Neighborhood Engagement is really one of the mechanisms for, in addition to reframing how the church functions out beyond the walls of the church, again, affirming everything that the church does inside, but compelling the church to take that outside as well, as a core part of our identity. So there's something we call the cycle of oppression. And the cycle of oppression, and again, hopefully this can be a handout, it's a tool, write this down, draw it down as you're in your homes or where you're watching this. But the cycle of oppression, it begins with people being stigmatized, targeted, and it can be an individual or group. And then we attach to that person or that group misinformation. And then based on the misinformation, that becomes our justified mistreatment. And then based on the justified mistreatment, it becomes internalized behavior. Now, when I talk about internalized behavior, I say that an example of internalized behavior is if I have a dog, and every time I approach my dog, I kick my dog. Sooner or later, I'll approach my dog, and even though it didn't do anything wrong, it will act like it did something wrong. That's an example of internalized behavior. So, because of the tyranny of time, I'm going to jump to an example of the cycle of targeted, and use the example of a target would be George Floyd. So George Floyd, there's targeting, you see a George Floyd, and then misinformation comes to mind that he stole a $20 bill or whatever that is, that misinformation, that he's a criminal, whatever. And then the next part of that becomes the justified mistreatment, and that because of this misinformation, I'm justified and pulling him over, and ultimately killing him in the extreme. And then the internalized behavior that said George Floyd becomes a criminal. Does those kind of activities. So this is a really important tool because let's say that I'm a police officer, and my misinformation about African American males is that they're criminals. And if that's my misinformation that I am kind of triggered with, then my justified mistreatment is to pull them over. Do you know the term driving while black? So that's an example. And then young people, African American males, then say, well, that's how I get treated. I'll start being a criminal. I'll start, treating police in a negative way. So the cycle, and what we do is we blame the very people that we set up into these targets. So we could be, you look at this target, and instead of, you can just say for the target, say North Minneapolis. Misinformation about North Minneapolis is that it's crime infested, it's not safe, and then the justified mistreatment is redlining, don't buy a home there, don't put a business there, and it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, that internalized behavior, and that's why there are no jobs in North Minneapolis. There are no businesses in North Minneapolis. And does that start with North Minneapolis? No. It starts by the targeting of the cycle. You can say the same thing, targeted Lutheran churches in North Minneapolis. They can't grow there. You can't say that there are no Christians there, or say that, hopefully you get the idea of this cycle, and the mission that I would say for the Lutheran Church and for the Center for Leadership and Neighborhood Engagement is to demystify the cycle, to disrupt the cycle, to break the cycle. And that's what's happening with all of the protests, and since George Floyd, there's a far greater awareness of this cycle. Now, maybe people aren't conscious of it, but people are saying that what's going on isn't right. And people want to have conversation and relationship so that we're not operating out of this cycle, but having real authentic relationship and encounter and conversations. So I don't want to make it sound like it's a panacea and that there are not challenges in the world, but we're called to disrupt those places where this kind of systemic separation and injustice continues to go on. Now, I could, it's just as easily have talked about women in that cycle. Just to do this briefly. So let's say the cycle targeted is women. Misinformation about women is, if I'm a teacher, I might say they're not as smart as men in math and sciences, and the justified mistreatment is maybe don't call on them, don't encourage them to go in math and science. And if this room was filled with women, I would ask them if they know the term dummy down. Pretend not to know as much as you know because of this internalized behavior in the cycle. Or we could do women again and talk about targeting and misinformation and ask, do you ever look at the magazines in the grocery store? What do the women look like in those magazines? And what's the justified mistreatment if you don't look like those magazines? And then for the internalized behavior, talk about anorexia and bulimia. Talking about how these cycles exist. And the way to break down these cycles is to be in relationship with one another and not operate out of misinformation, but information, out of authentic relationship. Another example of that cycle, that cycle is when President Trump talked about countries like Africa and Haiti as outhouses. That was simply a perpetuation of the cycle and stigmatizing some countries and elevating like Norway and Sweden. And when I heard that, I was really offended that the President of the United States was talking that way and exhibiting that cycle. But then when I thought about it too, don't we do that in the ways that we lift up some cultures and some people and the denial of others? So examples, you get it, I'm sure. So finally, why I believe that this cycle is so important, why it's so important that we like power up Elam and our church and to be out in our communities, is because we have not done a good job of telling the biblical story in real time. So those stories about Jesus in the scripture, and we've made it out that Jesus was some kind of nice guy going around being nice to people. Jesus was the Son of God who came into the world to be in relationship with real people in real struggles and cycles of oppression. So I invite you to look at those stories and how Jesus is the Son of God, God embodied in human form, comes into our world, and look at those stories about how Jesus is coming to people who are locked into cycles of oppression. Take a look at the one story about a woman at a well who goes to a well in the morning, and when she's in the community with all the other people, they tell her how terrible her life is and how all the marriages are broken down and all the misinformation about her life and how terrible her life is. And the result is that woman decides the last thing that she will do is go back to that well in the morning when the rest of the community gathers. So she goes to that well at the hottest part of the day because she does not want to hear that story about how awful her life is one more time. So she goes to the brutal time of the day when she knows that she won't have to hear those stories. And Jesus comes to that woman and he has a relationship with her and liberates her and says, go and sin no more. Live a renewed life. Be a new creation. And so those stories in the Bible about children and about outcasts, all of those stories about people that are stigmatized and locked in the cycles. And God brings God's self into relationship with those people and disrupts the cycles. And people of God, Elam, that's your calling. That is our calling, to be the people of God, disrupting those cycles, breaking those things, and saying to people, God is with you. You are a child of God. You are welcome to experience the love and the reality of God. And so, together, that is our work. Together, that is our calling. To be the people of God, embodying the story of God, coming and being in relationship with people. That we all are God's beloved. That's what we experience in the liturgy. It's time to take our liturgy into the streets, into our neighborhood, into those places where people want and need to hear the story, want and need to experience God's embrace, want and need to experience God's love. Thank you, Elam, for the opportunity to be with you, and I wish you the greatest blessing as you continue on your journey and the call for how God is calling you to your next venture and being a faithful people of God.
Kelly? Pastor Kelly, I have a question. Very nicely done and nicely framed and put together. So, I guess I'm just sort of asking you to say this again, maybe in some ways, but The story that we welcome people into, as you pointed out, is a very subversive story. I mean, liberty to the captives, good news for the poor. Jesus was killed on a Roman cross. The empire killed him. There's a lot of people. I mean, so in other words, that story does then challenge people, as you rightly say. Just how do you, maybe you can talk about it again. How do you balance that sense of challenge with being actually genuinely welcoming as well? Because in our culture, there's a lot of folks who say, I don't want any part of that. It gets politicized, in other words.
It's how we tell the story is it's a hermeneutic. It's something that we have to embody, much like Jesus did. And knowing that there will be resistance, there is resistance. So Mark, one of the things that I would say that I have to walk is, I could be up here saying white supremacy, racism, and how that has co-opted our story. But I don't want to lose the audience, right, and the opportunity. So that's the interpretive challenge of the leadership within the congregation to be on that journey of the commitment to transcend the boundary of race and class and culture. And it really is an interpretive role, and that is also where being entrusted leaders or having leadership and building that, that's why things like the IDI, the intercultural development, is really important as a tool. Organizing is a tool, because organizing is a gift for one-to-one conversations. Right? So how do you bring people along? And for me personally, one of the greatest challenges for the church, and I think generically, but particularly in the Lutheran church, and maybe it's not particularly Lutheran, is people come to church expecting to be comfortable. And so people don't embrace tension as part of the process, and everything about the gospel is about embracing tension. And Jesus, all the stories models how to tension, and also leverage tension as well. This last week, the gospel was a parable where Jesus tells the parable about the banquet. And so when I translate that story of the banquet, think about Jesus really, on my imagination, Jesus is telling that parable because he's getting so much resistance. And he's talking about people not responding to coming to the banquet because they're too busy. The leaves are at their heights, or my kid's got a soccer game. All those excuses that the gospel isn't that important because I have these recreational needs, whatever. So that part of it. And then I imagine the part about where Jesus kicks the person out because he's now wearing a wedding robe. And I translate that, it's like there's a wedding and somebody comes to the wedding not wearing a wedding robe but a MAGA hat. Right? And so it's an affront to the occasion. Right? It's drawing attention from the occasion, which is salvation, to one's own politics. So I'm kind of going all over with your question, but the core of that for me, that I dance around in order that I get invited, to speak, is I'm cautious about how I leverage the language or how I say what I say, because white supremacy, racism is co-opting our identity as a church. But in a congregation of 200, maybe maybe there's 5 leaders that are ready to embrace the tension that comes with that.
Thank you. It's helpful.
I have one other question, and it's the practicality of trying to understand. It's one thing in intellectually understand these different worldviews of people and of people of different colors, races, but then to actually think about how do you blend that in a worship setting where people, like you said, they want to be comfortable, but they also are tribal, and there's strength in that, and so you have a sense of, in the white community, a time, everything is limited to an hour in the Lutheran church, and so how do you blend those African and Asian and white, how do you just think about what you can do out in the community so you aren't having to give up what is sort of your frame of reference always?
You just named it. When you said give up, give up means you own it. And so there's an investment in it in terms of whose it is. And it doesn't really work to invite people in if it isn't a shared, or even on a commitment toward a shared experience. And I don't mean this to be negatively critical, but that's a huge challenge, is that the Lutheran Church and Presbyterian, Episcopalian still are invested in their identity from getting off of the boat. So the music, all of those investments. So this worldview is really names it in terms of, so if I think about in Minnesota in our Lutheran church, and the amazing fine choirs that we have at Augsburg and St. Albans. And so when those people graduate from Augsburg, they go to a church where music is going to be of that caliber. And so the more complicated the music, the more they drool. Right? Well, the other end of that spectrum is, well, that's the last thing that a Latino, Hispanic person who hasn't assimilated. So it's, and I don't have the answer for that, but being conscious of, so it's a conscious decision is the critical thing about that. It's like, if that's what a congregation chooses to do, know that you're making that choice over a choice to be something else. So Redeemer really did embody that, and hopefully still does, where passing the peace would take 15 minutes. And there are plenty of Lutherans that would come to Redeemer and with the understanding that's anathema, you don't do that. But at the end of the experience, they said, well, I want to come back. So it's about moving from that place of locked into that cycle of out thinking about right and wrong to actually having the experience where saying, well, maybe there is something to this. So another example, so David Scher does a hip-hop ministry. So when hip-hop emerged, David translated the liturgy from the Kyrie to the benediction into hip-hop. And there were plenty of pastors that said, I can't stand that music. And then they experienced the liturgy and they loved it. So it's a difference between the messages that are going in our heads that are based from the cultural experience of right and wrong and shame to actually having the experience. The other thing that's dangerous about that is those judgments that we make about the music. We're not just making judgments about the music. We're making judgments about the people who that music comes from. And so to be able to have experiences with the people, that liberates us to have a different, maybe a broader picture of that and understanding of that. But kind of the bottom line, I would say, really goes back to how I became a Lutheran. It's that when people experience relationship, when people experience a transforming reality of God, people are more likely to walk through, all of the all of the challenges because we're in a relationship. Which also maybe goes back to some of those things about where you come from. Speak so loudly I can hardly hear a word you're saying. You have to earn the right to be heard. There's so many things that happen when people are in a relationship that are not, they will not possibly happen if they're based on this cognitive, what we know about people from reading a book or watching the news or listening to a president.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you. Question, Mark.
Thank you for the really thoughtful, thought-provoking words. A lot to chew on. We have a council meeting coming up on Tuesday. I plan to share a little bit of it. So thank you for being here, for your work, and wish you blessings in the work with the CNLE as well.
Thank you.
This is a beginning, I think, of a conversation that Elam will be looking at race. We've already had a group that has been meeting, talking about racial justice, and this is just another step in our path moving towards this important work of who is our neighbor and what is the role for Elam in our world, and especially when we think about the racial inequities that are going on, have been going on, and how do we as a people, God's people, how do we move towards that instead of away from it. So we look forward to more conversation about this, and there is some resources that Pastor Kelly gave that will be attached to the video once it's up in November, so you can look at that. There's some podcasts that are really interesting. I encourage you to take a look at those, for those in the audience, the home audience, I should say. All right, thank you, and we'll see you next month.